Before I start, I'd like to thank Dr. O'Neill for asking me to give this talk, and to Dr. Reams for supporting the effort she and I are making to get us, as a body, to consider these admittedly big topics. We won't be able to plumb their depths here and now, but I pray as we get the conversation started, you will find some value. What is the value of liberal arts education? What's more, what is the value of Christian liberal arts education? How do students and their families approach it? How do we approach it? We use these words, but like a lot of Christian jargon, we sometimes lose sight of what they mean. One of our QEP goals is integrative learning, and while I don't have all the answers, I want to revitalize a vision for what the liberal arts college can look like in a world full of whitewashed tombs bearing that institutional description. If nothing else, awash in a sea of discouragement, trouble, and anxiety, both our students and often ourselves, what a privilege and responsibility we have as Christian educators. I expect we have all struggled at one time or other to convince our students that what we are teaching them is worthwhile. Whether teaching theater appreciation to athletes or mathematics to music majors, we meet with resistance to what we are trying to accomplish in the classroom, even when we are only working with majors in our own discipline. Maybe you teach nascent nurses who nurture negativity toward chemistry, psychology students who sigh at the sight of research methods, or, in my case, music majors who moan about music theory. Music students come to study with a particular voice or piano teacher. They come to train as music teachers. They come to sing in the choir or the band. They do not come for the music theory. After all, it is basically music math, and in their view, who wants that? Music theory, or pick the hang-up in your own discipline, is something to be endured, not something that will, on a practical level, greatly enhance the quality of their education, and on a more profound level, open their eyes and ears to the patterns of the cosmos. Of course, not all students assume such antipathy, but enough do that I have long pondered how to convince them to buy in, as it were. Is this relatable? Here's a hypothetical dialogue that broadly condenses conversations I've had with students over the last few years. It's a kind of archetype. Even though the specific questions and answers may vary in specific conversations, ultimately they seem to lead back to this basic pattern. The first question is, why should you do this particular assignment? It all starts here because this is the presenting problem, the thing the student needs to do but doesn't want to do. However, the assignment is merely the presenting symptom, not the cause. Students usually respond with something like, I must do it to pass the course. This is usually as deep as most students go on their own. This is why many of us have seen increases in academic dishonesty, because the reason for the assignment is not to learn, but to check off a box that ultimately doesn't matter. However, the student has revealed that there is a higher purpose, a telos, that this assignment is supposed to serve. But alone, it's still not a very good reason. Why is passing the course important? The response, too, is typical. Something like, it's required. It's all about getting the grade, to get the GPA, to keep the scholarship, to get the piece of paper that says you did those things. What a vapid, unfulfilling experience. Where is actual learning in this equation? Where is the love of excellence? Where is the joy of flexing intellectual muscle? Still, a pattern is emerging. There is something more important than merely passing the course. Why do you wish to complete the degree, I ask? Because they don't see the absurdity and pointlessness of their responses. The two answers I get the most often are something like either to get a good job, a nebulous response whose meaning is usually not even clear to the student, or two, to be an educated person, which seems to assume education to be an inherent good. Both answers are woollier than a herd of alpaca. If a music major says good job to mean financially well off, then he needs to choose a different career. And is all education an inherently good endeavor? We who teach should not leave that answer unexamined, nor consider it a foregone conclusion, but that's beyond the scope of my time here. By this point, a student is either thinking, I'm the pointless one, asking questions with such obvious answers, or they're intrigued because they know by now that I'm not in the habit of asking pointless questions. Capitalizing on the fact that both of these student responses necessitate an understanding of what is good, i.e., a good job, or that education is a good thing, eventually we get around to something like, why is a productive career good? Why is it good to be an educated person? The answer is something like, to be a contributing member of society, to live a fulfilling life. Now maybe we're getting somewhere. At least these things are less vapid than some of the earlier responses. Helping society and living a full life are certainly good things, although still loosely understood, but they seem like ultimate goods only to those who are perishing, to paraphrase 1 Corinthians 1:18. But to us who are being saved, those goods are side effects of the highest good. So I asked the student, why are those things you mentioned desirable? To which they answer something like, well, that's what good people do. Okay, what then does it mean to be a good person? To be a good person is to orient yourself toward that highest good. So I asked the student, if the ultimate purpose of this assignment stands in an unbroken chain of reasons, a holistic hierarchy of values meant to orient you toward the highest good, how hard should you be working on this assignment? I've been trying to have some version of this conversation with my students fairly regularly, for both their benefit and mine. So how to do this? How do we reorient to a Christocentric view of the universe? Different approaches seem to resonate with different students, but here are some common threads that I have found to be helpful. What does it mean to be made in the image of God? Students, and let us be honest, all of us, struggle to keep our perspective, our sense of self-worth, our identity rooted here. It must not be about doing the assignment, to pass the course, to complete the degree, to get the certification, to land the internship, to get the job, to earn the promotion, to etc. To what? Increasingly, we in the humanities hear statements like, that major is worthless because it doesn't result in a career. Everything is about job readiness? If young people want to be job market ready, they don't need to go to college. What can we offer that is more than just career preparation? Is the value of higher education only measured in dollars earned? A job at Dow Chemical or Pfizer could result in quite the lucrative career. But is that why studying chemistry is valuable? Society and parents and friends and siblings all buy into these lesser values. If we buy into it, if we project our Christian institutions of learning as mere certification factories, we cheapen our own telos, our own purpose, and make it that much harder for students to awaken to the richness of experience and depth of fulfillment available to them. Most of them have never known to think that there's more. If a student is ultimately seeking happiness, a full life, and if we know that the only fulfillment of these longings is by orienting toward that highest good, that is, worship of the triune God, we have an advantage unknown in secular academia. The end is not the degree or the job or even happiness. These are but means to, or result from, a greater end. We might paraphrase the Gospel of Matthew in saying, these are the things sought by those who do not know God, but rather seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these other things will be added. But they are not to be the end in themselves. Learning is an adventure. The calling of bearing God's image is a call to adventure. And in any adventure, the hero experiences slog and excitement, defeat and triumph, the temptation to turn back, and the reward of seeing the quest through. And yours might be the only voice that ever tells that student that the university is not a certification factory. Education is not a transaction. Don't treat it like you are merely a consumer, because there is more at stake. To this point, C.S. Lewis makes some striking observations in this passage from the first chapter of The Abolition of Man. Here he differentiates between an old-time-honored model of education, the one to which we appeal when we call ourselves a liberal arts institution, and a new one that thinks of education purely in terms of its utility. He writes, quote, the old dealt with its pupils as grown birds deal with young birds when they teach them to fly. The new deals with them more as the poultry keeper deals with young birds, making them thus and thus for purposes of which the birds know nothing. In a word, the old was a kind of propagation, men transmitting manhood to men. The new is merely propaganda. End quote. Pursue excellence. Anything of value is worth working for. Anything worth doing is worth doing well. If we've recognized the foregoing hierarchy of values that all we do serves a much greater purpose, then it's worth putting in the effort. I ask you, the student, to do hard things in order that you might find out who you are, to find out what you could be, to make your corner of the world a little better for yourself, your family, and your community. It is my job to pull the best out of you. We are here to encounter the transcendent. It will be hard and painful and lovely and epiphanic. True education is just as much about developing strength of character as it is about strength of mind, just as much about wisdom as it is about knowledge. Arguably, and historically, this was the purpose of liberal arts education, to learn to discern what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful. And when you find them, speak what is true, do what is good, and love what is beautiful. Be formed by these things. They will help sustain you when the world tries to chew you up. On this point, I will again defer to Lewis, who makes the observation that the long understood point of education was to learn to love that which is deserving of one's love. Quote, "Can you be righteous, asks Traherne, unless you be just in rendering to things their due esteem? All things were made to be yours, and you were made to prize them according to their value." St. Augustine defines virtue as ordo amoris, the ordinate condition of the affections, in which every object is accorded that kind of degree of love which is appropriate to it. Aristotle says that the aim of education is to make the pupil like and dislike what he ought. When the age for reflective thought comes, the pupil who has been thus trained in ordinate affections or just sentiments will easily find the first principles in ethics. But to the corrupt man, they will never be visible at all, and he can make no progress in that science. Plato before him had said the same. The little human animal will not at first have the right responses. It must be trained to feel pleasure, liking, disgust, and hatred at those things which really are pleasant, likable, disgusting, and hateful. In the Republic, the well-nurtured youth is one who would see most clearly whatever was amiss in ill-made works of man or ill-grown works of nature, and with a just distaste would blame and hate the ugly even from his earliest years, and would give delighted praise to beauty, receiving it into his soul and being nourished by it, so that he becomes a man of gentle heart. I will urge you, the student, towards sharpness, virtue, and self-discipline. I want you to be a formidable, dangerous musician, not just another anybody with a bachelor's degree. At one time it was assumed that to learn anything, you would apprentice yourself to someone who had mastered that knowledge. You would spend countless hours poring over the works of past masters. It may well be that you won't like everything I ask you to study, but it is crucial for us all to learn to be attentive to things outside of ourselves. Our responsibility as educators is greater than we might want to admit. For some students, any one of these ideas might be a salve to an already world-weary heart. But our sinfulness makes this hard, to believe what is true, to pursue what is good, and to love the truly beautiful. But, like the circumference of a circle, they exist because and are the evidence of the invisible center, whom the Apostle John identified as the Logos, the Christ. Jesus declares to us, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Truth is a person. He, the Logos, the Word made flesh, who was in the beginning and participated in the creation, spoke the world into existence, and each thing he made, he saw that it was good. And this is why the Apostle Paul tells us to meditate on these things, the things that are true, good, and beautiful, because that which is authentically true, good, and beautiful orients us toward God himself, the divine wellspring of all truth, goodness, and beauty. To quote the Christian philosopher Peter Kreeft, we are head, hands, and heart. We respond to truth, goodness, and beauty. We are this because we are images of God. Each of us is one person with three distinct powers. In seeking goodness, beauty, and truth, we are emulating the one whose image we bear. Each discipline tells us about these three virtues. We might even say that anything that possesses one of these virtues must also contain elements of all three, because all three find their source and origin in the one who called the world into being. They are characteristics of the Logos. But Logos does not only mean word, as it's commonly translated. It also means reason and order. We get our word logic from Logos. And where do we think the words musicology and criminology and psychology and archaeology, biology, sociology, ecology, philology, paleontology, ophthalmology. Need I go on? What do all these have in common? They seek the order of knowledge within their respective fields. So, to Peter Kreeft's point then, truth is right-ordered thought, goodness is right-ordered action, and beauty is the right ordering of our hearts toward what is worthy of our love. So much of this world encourages the disordering of our affections. We are encouraged to follow our inclinations, to gratify our baser desires, take the path of least resistance, celebrate grotesque and aberrant behavior, and seek the comfort and convenience of self over most other concerns. We do not love God as we ought, or our neighbor, the very two pillars that uphold all the law and the prophets. The world would continue to seek the disordering of our affections, and it is for this reason we have an opportunity to counter that slow drift into apathy and self-service. When our end becomes Christocentric, we find that our telos is, and has always been, to know the Logos more deeply. Whatever and however I teach should ultimately point back to Him. Even for those of us who teach the humanities, how can it all be about God when we're talking about Keats or Beethoven or Rembrandt or Constantine? We're not studying His creation directly, right? But these people, Christian or not, were made in God's image. Disfigured images, yes. But as when your eyes are dazzled by a bright light, the afterglow of its image persists in the darkness behind your eyelids. Along with the astronomer Kepler, we are invited to think God's thoughts after him. Along with the philologist Tolkien, we are welcomed to become sub-creators, enacting the imago Dei in imitating the one whose image we bear. It is humanity's sacred honor to be called to imitate him by walking his path and thinking his way. We are not here to serve only what we like. The great monuments of art, literature, history, architecture, scientific discovery, these things form us, not the other way around. It is not usually the disposition of the servant to think himself free, and yet paradoxically, it is in the service of our Lord that we find perfect freedom. The author Madeleine L'Engle once famously opined that the artist must serve her work, and the 19th century Polish poet Zygmunt Krasiński similarly wrote, "A river of beauty flows through you, but you are not beauty." To let students, and perhaps ourselves, assume that the work is meant to serve them makes them the master rather than allowing the master to mold them through serving his work. To do otherwise is to become inflated with one's own importance, to become deluded into thinking that the current zeitgeist must be true because it's newer or more widely accepted. We all must learn to submit ourselves to those who have a better sense of truth, goodness, and beauty than we do. Students may never have been called to be formed by these great things, but have only thought they ought to conform the world to themselves. To reject this service is to impoverish oneself, to sell our birthright for a bowl of stew. It is counterintuitive and hard and humbling, none of the things students, or we, like very much. And that's why we need to be reminded over and over, when we subject ourselves to the right masters, when we give our hearts over to what they might teach us, surprisingly, we find ourselves freed from subjugation to ignorance. And that's why they're called the liberal arts. This verse from Proverbs is, of course, God speaking to us, but it is echoed in parents to their children, mentors to their mentees, professors to students, and those of us who have mastered our respective disciplines, to those of us who have studied them. This is a long passage from Proverbs, but it is a linchpin for so many of these ideas. Here, the author personifies wisdom, who is addressing us. I've tried to highlight two ideas in particular in pink and yellow. So much of what is said of wisdom in this passage vibrates at the same frequency as the prologue to John's Gospel. And as the Proverbs passage continues, we see that the wisdom and the logos are described in strikingly similar ways. And the next time Christmas rolls around and you're tempted to skip some of the verses of O Come, Emmanuel, don't forget this one. O come, thou wisdom from on high, who orderest all things mightily, to us the path of knowledge show, and teach us in her ways to go. Because wisdom, like truth, is a person, the same person, the Logos. And frankly, knowledge is not enough. As we know, the internet is full of knowledge. It's a necessary component, but it's often mistaken for the point of education. Too often we think of ourselves as content delivery mechanisms. Putting points of knowledge together into meaningful patterns might be thought of as understanding, but wisdom, as we've been reminded, is of highest value. We show wisdom when we direct our knowledge and understanding in service of the highest good, when we are willing to let the Logos teach us what is worthy of our attention. For we know that it is the fear of the Lord that is the beginning of wisdom. As often as this verse is quoted, folks usually stop after wisdom and forget that knowledge and understanding are in here too. They all work together. So I return to asking, what is the telos of a Christian liberal arts university? The Apostle Paul, as he often does, ties it all together. For the Jews demand signs and the Greeks seek wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. The following quotation is something I borrowed from the door of my friend and colleague, Professor Sue Gockel. Quote, "If you want to build a ship, don't drum up the men to gather wood, divide the work, and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea." It is so apt for our purposes here and now. If our students only ever focus on the utility of education, then they will miss out on the purpose of education, because education is a call to adventure. We have such an opportunity to revitalize the Christian roots of liberal arts learning, using avenues by which we may more truly adore our Lord. What a thing we can offer our students that so many other institutions do not, and what an adventure for us to continually orient ourselves toward the highest good. Now I realize this has all been floating up in the realm of abstraction and philosophy. It's all theory, and I'm a music theorist, so that's where I live. But what is the praxis? It starts today with contemplating and discussing with each other how these ideas might enliven our respective schools, departments, and classrooms. I would love for us to continue to have conversations, both now and in the coming months.